It's great to be here. It's really great to have heard nothing from the minister, thank God. Bit of the hot seat here. I remember 3 years ago when a different minister lobbed a bit of a grenade in the whole conference. I don't have to quite actually respond to anything that he said. So I'm really happy this slide is actually still correct. Wasn't sure that it was going to be. We got a groundbreaking, sorry I had to throw the pun in, I don't have any more, thank God. Groundbreaking new regulation to govern how we manage and move soil around this province. This is a pretty big step. It's had a bit of a rocky rollout, of course. We're still in the first box there. We kind of met the second box, sort of, not really, well, temporarily. But it looks like, because the minister didn't say anything differently, that we are set to have the majority of this regulation in place and in force in less than 1 month. That's pretty big news. This is a big new step for Ontario and for the management of reuse of soils. But interestingly enough, the idea of reusing soils is not new. This is something we've been doing for a long time. In fact, my first exposure to reusing soils was in my very first engineering job. I was a geotechnical technician, and I spent an entire summer work term doing compaction testing on a residential subdivision. I was bringing in a lot of soil. That was 30 years ago. Oh man, you want to feel old? You say that to a room full of people. But the point is this new regulation is applying to something that we've been doing for a long time. And so the question is, what does that mean? If we've been doing this forever, what does the new regulation mean in terms of how we manage and reuse soil? I mean, the obvious answer, of course, is that regulations impose rules. And this regulation imposes rules in what I have generously grouped into 3 different boxes, sort of broad assumptions or broad achievements of the regulation. And you can read these rules up there because I'm assuming you can read. You don't need me to read it out for you. But the reality is that this regulation, and Kevin alluded to this, has a bit of controversy to it. There are a lot of people who don't like this regulation. There are a lot of people who were hoping that the minister was going to announce that the planning rules were going to be extended and paused even further. There were even people who were hoping that the minister was going to say, this regulation's dead. It's gone. We're not doing this. I'm not one of those people. In fact, I'm going to take a bit of a contrarian view, considering that some of my clients are those people. But I think this regulation is a good thing. I think this regulation has enormous promise. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a consultant and this is going to generate a lot of work for me. Gosh, you guys are a cynical bunch. I'm saying that because I fundamentally believe that this regulation has the potential to significantly improve the way we have been managing and reusing soils in this province. And that's based on my own experience in this industry. And I'm going to deal with this concept and explain to you why I believe this way, basically by attacking each one of these sort of broad accomplishments, the rules that the regulation puts in place. This first rule is actually fairly simple because, in fact, I don't think it does much for us. We're setting up, as Kevin said, a framework to manage excess soils. People are going to be much more comfortable with the concept. Hopefully we'll see fewer of these kinds of headlines in the papers or on CBC News. The reality is, though, is that excess soils, we've been managing them for a long time. We've been reusing soils for a long time not because of this, but because of one thing. It's money. It's really expensive to put soil in a licensed waste receiving. It's really expensive to buy soil from a pit or quarry. If you don't need to, why would you? People haven't been. So realistically, while this is going to improve public perception, it's not really going to change much for our industry because fundamentally, we're doing it because it makes sense. We may see some parties who are actually reluctant to reuse soils because of reputational issues or extreme concern about legislation. They'll come on board, but really those parties aren't significant players in our industry. It's the developers, and they've been doing this for a long, long time. So let's get to the heart of the matter. The real thing that I think is going to change things, and that's rules relating to how we actually, to the environmental quality of excess soils. And when I say that, there's 2 aspects of that, of course. There's the benchmarks that we use to say this soil is this quality, and there's the process by which we determine what benchmark our soil actually meets. And so to give you some appreciation of my opinion on excess soils and what this means for our industry, I'm going to put you on a little case study. This is actually a file that I worked on in 2005. I know some people in this room may recognize it. But what you see on screen is a satellite image from 2004, late 2004. And there are two triangular-shaped aggregate quarries pictured. The one on the left, we're going to call it the North Pit, and the one on the right, we're going to call it the South Pit. I know the South Pit is slightly north of the North Pit, but they're on the south side of the road and the north side of the road, so that's the names that we used. These two pits have a rather unique site plan. A site plan is a license for an aggregate extraction facility. The site plan required that at the end of extraction, as part of the rehabilitation of the pits, they had to be infilled completely, right up to the top. That's very unusual. But the site pit operator was a crafty fellow. He figured out how he could do this. He was charging developers and construction managers money so they could dump their surplus soils in his pits. So he was meeting his rehabilitation requirements, which is normally an expense, and making money off of it. But there was a lot of concern about how the pit operator was actually managing this activity. See, one of the things about these two sites is that they were located, or are located, directly up gradient of a municipal well field that serves 25,000 homes. It's a lot of people. Moreover, the extraction activities, and you can see this on the right-hand side, on the South Pit, the extraction activities had actually exposed the aquifer from which that well field was drawing water. That big blue or greenish pond, it looks green in this light, but it's blue actually, that's actually groundwater manifesting its service. Groundwater that serves as a potable water resource for tens of thousands of people. That's not a good thing. So when I got involved in this project in 2005, the North Pit, which you can see in this image, had basically been infilled almost completely. But the South Pit still needed something like 1.2 million cubic meters of fill. The Ministry of the Environment was very concerned about what happened in the North Pit. The Ministry of Natural Resources, as the regulator of pits and quarries, was very concerned about what was going to happen in the South Pit. And the local municipality was freaking out over both things. So a bunch of things were happening now. The pit operator had orders from the Ministry of the Environment to investigate what they had done on the North Pit and what that meant in terms of water quality. And the Ministry of Natural Resources decided that it would put up forth an amendment to the site plan. And that amendment would essentially make sure that would eliminate the need to place any more fill in the South Pit. And that effect would be to have the site operator surrender their license and basically shut down their infilling activities. Pit operator was making a lot of money off this. He objected to it, and so that was referred to the OMB, the Ontario Municipal Board, for adjudication. In helping my client respond to the Ministry of Environment's orders and prepare for their OMB hearing, I literally reviewed boxes of reports that had been submitted to the pit operator in support of applications to place fill in the North Pit. We were trying to figure out what they had done. And I can tell you, in those literally hundreds of reports that I and others in my company went through, the standard of practice that we saw, well, it varied considerably, as you might imagine. Some of them were actually pretty good. Give you a good idea of what they investigated, how they investigated, what the quality was, where it was appropriate to place it. But there were others, now, let's just say they wasn't so good. There were literally reports that were nothing more than a laboratory certificate of analysis with a comparison to some randomly selected site condition standards. The problem that also existed is that none of these reports really dealt with the specific concerns unique to this site. And the pit operator didn't have a background in environmental site assessment. And so, despite any intentions they may have had to place only the best quality of soil in the North Pit and then later on in the South Pit, their decision-making wasn't really well-founded. Fortunately, when we did our intrusive investigations, we didn't actually find any evidence of adverse impact to the water quality. So that was good news for the tens of thousands of people who were drinking the water. Well, that's actually not true. We did find evidence of impact. We found sodium and chloride. But those results tend to go up in the winter, drop in the spring and summer. So you can probably guess what we attributed it to. But that idea of runoff from roads, from highway salting, impacting the water quality, kind of brings up the issue about whether or not that site plan amendment from the Ministry of Natural Resources, whether or not that pit should be allowed to be infilled. You see, groundwater is exposed. All that runoff is being directly discharged to the aquifer, an aquifer used by a lot of people. You can mitigate that risk and other risks, like say somebody decides to dispose of some illegal wastes inside that pit, nice pond there, bury it, no one will ever see it. You can mitigate that risk by infilling that, because at least that way you won't be directly discharged into the aquifer. But of course, if you place fill inside that pit, you might bring in contaminated soil or contamination. And in fact, you could even put that in direct contact with groundwater, and that would be equally detrimental to the water quality. So this was an issue that had to be adjudicated. It wasn't my decision, thank God. It was the OMB's decision. And so they issued a decision. I think that was in May of 2006. I'm going off memory. You can probably see it because I can't from my ankle. And I'm paraphrasing here. You can look this up. It's online. It's a public document. But the OMB decided that it was better to infill that pit because there was no risk-free option here. There was a risk if you left it open. There was a risk if you infilled it. But the risks of infilling could be managed and mitigated if you put in place appropriate protocols. Keep in mind, this is 2006. Let's kind of look at the fill acceptance protocols that the OMB decided and that were ultimately put in place for this pit. Number one, that the environmental characterization of any material proposed for placement in that pit had to be done with an understanding of the current and historical activities at the proposed source site. Number two, that when we sampled the material that we proposed for shipment, we had to analyze for all the potential contaminants of concern associated with that source site. And more importantly, the number and location of those samples had to be determined on the basis of the soil that we were proposing to ship and the locations of areas of potential environmental concern. Number three, are you guys seeing a pattern here? Number three, the report, so those findings of that sampling and analysis had to be documented in a detailed report prepared by or under the supervision of a qualified person. And number four, a qualified person had to assess and affirm that it was appropriate to place that proposed material in the south pit. Reg 40619, or excess soil regulation, isn't telling us to do anything we haven't known for a long time about characterizing and managing the risks of moving soil. So what good is it? It sets a benchmark. Because I'll tell you, there's a wide range in the quality of the soil reports that I saw when I was reviewing those in 2005. And I'll tell you, I saw the same wide range in the standards of practice in 2015. I saw it in 2020. I'm still seeing it now from some people. Our regulation will at least sets the benchmark. It sets an established process that we all agreed to, that we all will follow for assessing the soil and managing the risks in moving and reusing soil in this province. And I hear some people say, and Kevin alluded to it, it's too difficult, it's too complicated, it's too confusing, it's too onerous to do all this work, it's too expensive to do all this testing, and it's not necessary. Well, I'm going to quibble, it is necessary, I just told you why it's necessary. But for the other ones, I understand what you're saying, but I want to put this in some context, and I want you to think back to 2010 and 2011. For those of you who are qualified persons and were practicing at that time, you'll remember we had some very significant changes coming to our brownfields regulation. Regulation 15304. Brand new site condition standards. New ways of choosing which sites we're going to use. Extremely prescriptive requirements for phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments. And I heard what people were saying back then. I said it too. This regulation is too complicated, it's too confusing. These requirements for assessing sites are too onerous and way too expensive to do, and it's not necessary. We already have a regulation, we're already filing RSCs. We don't need this. But you know what, it's been 11 years. And the earth didn't end when that regulation came into force. And in fact, I would tell you right now The standards of practice for an environmental site assessment in this province are immeasurably better now than they were in 2010. And that's not just in the regulated work. Even in due diligence, CSA, ASTM, whatever standard you want to reference, even due diligence assessments routinely talk about the concepts we have from Reg 153, the brownfields regulation. Areas of potential environmental concern, potential contaminating activities, requirements to delineate, requirements to verify the restoration of groundwater. That's all there. And I say to you that Reg 40619, this excess soil, can do for excess soils what Reg 153 has done for environmental site assessment. And clicker works. Okay. We're going to switch to the last one right here because I have no idea how much time I have. I've probably run out. So the last one, I can't even read it. What does it say? Rules on the tracking and reporting on the movement of excess soils. You know, in some ways, I think this is actually the most important part of the regulation. And that seems weird, considering what I just said, but I'm going to tell you why. And here's the problem with my analogy and my reference to Reg 153 and environmental site assessment with respect to excess soils in 40619. The ministry has a different role in these two regulations. For Regulation 153 for brownfields, the ministry is a gatekeeper. Okay? You want your record of site condition, you got to submit something to the ministry. The ministry's going to look at it. And if they don't like it, they're going to tell you. Who hasn't seen that before, right? And they're going to make you do better. Why? Because if you don't get your record of site condition. Pretty simple. They forced our industry, and I'm talking the consulting industry, to improve our game. Now, for some of us, it wasn't a big step. For others, it was. But as a whole, the ministry forced us to do better. How are they going to do that for excess soils? There's no gatekeeper function for the ministry. They're not out there saying, no, you can't move the soil yet. You got to give me something else. They haven't chosen that role. Wisely, really, in my opinion. I can only imagine how long it would take to actually do a construction project if they had. But they do have a tool that could be used to bring that same level of expectation of standards of practice. And that's the registry. If you file a notice on the registry as a project area, I know most of us in the consulting world aren't doing that, but our clients are. But if you were filing that notice, the ministry can follow up with you. They can check and see whether you followed the rules. Where are your reports? Do they meet the requirements of the reg? They can also follow up with all the places you sent your soil and see if they followed the rules. And conversely, if you are a reuse site, you file a notice, the ministry can follow up with you. Were you following the requirements? Did you have in place all the things you said you did when you affirmed you did when you submitted your notice? Did all your sites that sent you soil file a notice on the registry? If they didn't, did they have a legitimate exception for not doing so? The ministry has a tool, and it could use that tool to achieve for excess soil management what Reg 153 has done for environmental site assessment. But there's a problem. The problem is this. We're at a fork in the path. To do everything I just said the ministry could do, and I would say has to do, it takes resources, it takes commitment. And so far, unfortunately, I haven't seen any indication that the ministry has the resources available to it, or if it does have the resources, that it is prepared to spend them. So which path are we going to take? I see one path where we have an effective enforcement regime, and where, because of that, the ministry forces our industry as a whole to vastly improve the way we are managing excess soils, to do what that fill acceptance protocol for the South Pit in 2006 required for one location at every location across this province. I like that path, but I see another path where the ministry doesn't do that, where we have people who follow the rules because they're going to follow the rules. Some people are like that. But we've got a whole bunch of other people who look at those first bunch of people and think, chumps. And they just do what they've always been doing, what they're doing now, what they were doing 2 years ago, what they were doing 10 years ago and 16 years ago, doing whatever they want. And we wind up exactly where we are now. So I ask you, which path do you want to take? I know my choice. And we're just going to sit, watch, and hope for the best, because I have nothing else. Thank you.